Okay, in this lecture video, we're going to talk about what goes on with dissolving, because a lot of the chemical reactions that we're going to be talking about in the future, and just a lot of chemical compounds and molecules in general, are often dissolved in one another. And so when one substance dissolves in another, we have a solution. And a solution is composed of two parts. So those parts are the solvent and the solute. So the solvent part of the solution is what you have the most of. It's the biggest part of that solution. And the solute is what's dissolved. Okay, so the solute is dissolved in the solvent. And when we talk about that solute, we often want to talk about how much of that solute do we actually have dissolved. So we can talk about that solution being either concentrated, which means we have a lot of solute dissolved, or dilute, which means we have a little bit of solute dissolved. In particular, we're going to focus on talking about a specific kind of solution, and that solution is one in which the solvent is water. And when we have a solution where the solvent is water, that solution is referred to as an aqueous solution. And you'll see substances indicated as AQ, which stands for aqueous. So whenever you see that, that means that your solute is dissolved in water, or that particular chemical species is dissolved in water. So you can change how much of a solute dissolves in a solvent. You can increase its solubility in a few different ways, one of which is increasing the temperature. So as you increase the temperature, you increase solubility. So the hotter the solvent is, the more solute can dissolve in it. So you start off under conditions where we would say the solution is unsaturated. That means the solvent has plenty of room for solute to dissolve. Eventually, though, it will reach a point where we say that the solution is now saturated. That means you cannot dissolve one more iota of solute into that solvent. However, there is a special case where you can trick the solution a little bit, heat it up a whole bunch, dissolve more solute in it, and then cool it down slowly. And when it cools down slowly, that solute stays dissolved. And that particular type of solution is one which is called supersaturated. That means it has more solute dissolved in it than should have been possible. So you can make things dissolve faster, and you may have discovered this just when you're cooking, is one thing you can do is increase the temperature. Okay, so if you're trying to make hummingbird water and you're dissolving a whole bunch of sugar in water, you heat it up to get all that sugar to dissolve faster, otherwise it'd take quite a long time. You also might stir it up or grind up the solute into tiny pieces, because when you do that, you increase the surface area of that solute and you make it more accessible to dissolving. So those are three ways that can speed up the rate of dissolving. And one of the reasons why those methods work is because when a substance dissolves, you have interactions between the solute and the solvent molecules. So let's take an example where we're going to take sodium chloride, that's table salt, and dissolve it in water. So we could represent that using one of the first types of chemical reactions we've looked at, although there is no actual chemical reaction taking place. So what we're seeing here is we start out with solid sodium chloride, and then what I'm not showing here is the fact that we're putting it in H2O. Sometimes we write that over the arrow. But the way we can tell is that on the right-hand side of the equation, so this is sort of, the left-hand side is the before and the right-hand side is the after. On the right-hand side, now we have aqueous, which tells us we have dissolved the sodium chloride. And what you see happening here is that the sodium chloride started out as a molecule that was together, but after dissolving, the ions that compose that molecule have broken apart. So let's take a look at what happens when we dissolve something. So this is a pictorial representation of sodium chloride dissolving in water. So these little guys right here represent the water molecules. Red is oxygen, white is hydrogen. Then we have sodium cations, represented by these positively charged spheres, and we have these slightly larger chloride anions represented by these negatively charged spheres. So when you have an ionic compound like sodium chloride, you can see that when it's solid, all of the ions are next to one another, and you sort of have this alternating array of positive and negative charges. But when the sodium chloride dissolves in water, what happens is each individual ion gets surrounded by water molecules. So in this case up here in the corner, we see the sodium cation, which is positively charged, is surrounded by the oxygen atoms of the water molecules. That's what's shown here in red. And that's because we know that that oxygen-hydrogen bond, remember, in water, is polar, which makes that oxygen slightly negative. So then we have a interaction between the positively charged cation and the slightly negatively charged oxygen that's that way because of the polar bond. So you get that electrostatic interaction, and that ion gets surrounded, and when it's surrounded by water molecules, it's dissolved. Then you can see over here, we have the chloride ion also being surrounded by water molecules, but you see that these water molecules are in a different orientation. In this case, it's the more positively charged part of the water molecule, the hydrogen atoms, that are interacting with the negatively charged chloride anion. But again, in this case, that anion is completely surrounded by solvent molecules. And so that's what's going on when something dissolves. So the last thing to remember then is that what dictates solubility and when we're talking about solubility, we know that polar solutes, like polar solvents, and nonpolar solutes, like nonpolar solvents. So maybe you've heard that before, like dissolves like. So, and even though in these particular examples we looked at sodium chloride, an ionic compound, dissolving,